Her research considers the histories, theories, and trajectories of documentary and reality-based media. Among her books are the Grierson, I always pause and bow when I hear the word Grierson, the Grierson Effect, Tracing Documentary's International Movement, and Cinephemera, Archives, Ephemeral Cinema, and New Screen Histories in Canada. Recently, she co-edited special issues of the Canadian Journal of Communication on cultural production in Canada and the European Journal of Cultural Studies on gender and property television after the financial crisis. Zoe's going to talk about IDOC's as democratic form, cruel optimism, question mark.
Well, thanks very much, Ian, and to the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting for giving me this opportunity to participate today. I should mention that my co-editor on the Cultural Production in Canada special issue, Danielle DeVoe, is here as well. So I decided to take this opportunity of thinking about digital platforms to think about the particular place of documentary media in this ecology. Now, obviously, documentary can be defined in many ways, but at the base, I think it's a genre of film and media making that's really tied up in compelling ways with participation and with an idea of democracy. And this is not to say that documentary ensures democracy. In fact, counter to many people's conceptions, documentary has been used by ideologues across the political spectrum. Why? Because being able to frame and define reality is one of the most valuable political tools that there is. However, given the close association of documentary with democracy in particular, I think it's important to remind ourselves that documentary communication has always been geared at a democratic deficit. And I use this phrase advisedly. It's certainly no coincidence that the genre of documentary pioneered by John Grierson and the British documentary film movement in the UK emerged to revitalize a national, popular, democratic spirit in the late 1920s, a point at which even liberal political theorists, the likes of John Dewey and Walter Lippmann, were declaring the failure of the liberal democratic ideal. Optimism about democracy is today under a cloud, wrote John Dewey in 1927 in The Public and Its Problems. Incidentally, the same year that Walter Lippmann opined in The Phantom Public that, quote, the modern citizen lives in a world which he cannot see, does not understand, and is unable to direct, unquote. So public media really emerge in this period in order to help constitute and maybe placate a national popular public. And documentary are intrinsically part of that vision. And it's a vision dedicated to making working people and their concerns visible in the public sphere. This is something that socialism of the period does quite well, and liberal democratic states are running to catch up with. It's important to remember the ways in which the emergence of the technology of documentary in this period is then tied to a hegemonic project to enlist the consent of the working class in a capitalist system. We can't forget that the 1920s was a time of massive labor unrest, followed by the Depression of the 1930s, which seemed to show without a shadow of a doubt the fundamental failures of the capitalist system. For this very reason, Roosevelt's New Deal enlisted documentary photographers to help expose the injustices of poverty and unemployment so that they could help reform the capitalist system. And it's amazing to reflect back that they made 77,000 photographs during the Depression to help represent and give shape to the experience of that economic crisis. And this is an example of how this idea moves back and forth across the Atlantic during this time of crisis. A famous, of course, documentary about social reform, housing problems from 1935. Get there in a minute. So it's also quite crucial to recall that early documentary is a genre based on media scarcity, one that attempts to help people understand local events in a big picture. So what does my personal experience of unemployment, for instance, or bad housing in this case, have to do with world economic conditions? And later during the war, why do I have to put my life on the line to serve my country? Emerging in the waning days of the British Empire, film documentary was a genre predicated not only on the fact of democratic deficit, but also on the idea of globalization. So one of documentary's early challenges was to find ways to help people visualize invisible social, political, and primarily economic forces at play in their lives. It's no coincidence that educational films of this sort were given a prominent role in the League of Nations mandate, and even more so in the establishment of UNESCO by the UN after the Second World War. So even though there were many early experiments that I won't at all be talking about with reality-based forms, including radical workers filmmaking and avant-garde docu-hybrids, documentary solidified through this kind of state support and transnational educational hegemonies into this genre that told a story from above about world historical conditions. These are films that are educational, even pedantic. And the kind of documentary made by most public broadcasters after the war followed this tradition and was often a site of convergence for big picture ideas and human interest. So while there's much that is commendable in public service broadcasting, it must be noted that it has always also been an effort to shape and even contain the idea of democracy and the very public that public broadcasters were established to serve. Because of real and ongoing efforts to squelch radical politics, liberal democracy's self-representation became tame, complacent, always presented as being about consensus rather than dissent. And I think of the recent CBC series, The Story of Us, as a good example of that attempt and then the pushback. Okay, as 1960s new social movements challenged the democratic configuration that had calcified in the Cold War period, documentary too was questioned. The genre was reinvigorated by a rejection of the authority of the school, the voiceover, and we saw a turn to observational styles and immersive forms. In addition, a demand for participatory styles of democratic politics led to more participatory forms of art as well. And here's where things get a little tricky, because almost immediately, capital responds to these anti-authority demands with a rebellious and anti-authoritarian form of capitalism. Participation and personalization become the watchword of the new economy in the global north, even as deindustrialization relocates jobs across the globe. The welfare state comes under serious attack, and the market emerges as the prime discursive locus of freedom and agency. Beginning in the 1980s and ramping up through the 90s, a history we are all too familiar with, public media are presented as outmoded and are defunded and dismantled. At the same time, the digital sector is encouraged with state regulation, policy, and funding, and tasked with re-energizing the economy. One result of the dot-com boom was the rise of interactive media platforms, which disrupted the dominant media platforms that we're now calling legacy media. These new platforms were tasked with demonstrating that the market was the best way to organize a public sphere. Interactivity was tagged as the best means to incite participation and engagement, two buzzwords of neoliberalism that were in many ways borrowed from the counterculture, because who can disagree with participation and engagement? Interactive media became at once the epitome of neoliberal values and a potential site of radical democratic potentials. So how are these potentials framed? First and foremost, through the idea of participation, which, according to a wonderful new book that I highly recommend by Darren Barney and others from McGill, The Participatory Condition in the Digital Age, participation becomes both environmental and normative. Rather than the mass audiences of the broadcast era, interactive digital platforms encourage and actually demand interactivity and engagement. And this is in words from the book, in the excessive promises of digital utopias, viewers are recast as users, seeking out their own information and interpretation of world events, unquote. In a couple of decades, digital capitalism recast the impulse for participation, which begins to stand in for all sorts of other political virtues like equality, justice, fairness, community, and freedom. And they recast this impulse into a mandatory part of the new economy. And many communications scholars, of course, have written about this compulsion to participate that drives the digital economy. Just for one example, political theorist Jodi Dean calls it communicative capitalism, which she describes as a condition where everyone is speaking, but only the loudest few are actually being heard. As she puts it, democratic ideals of access, inclusion, discussion, and participation are realized in and through expansions and intensifications of global telecommunications networks. But the speed, simultaneity, and interconnectivity of electronic communications produce massive distortions and concentrations of wealth from communicative exchanges and their technological preconditions, unquote. Every click, every like, every share increases the bottom line of one of these major global communications companies that we've been speaking about today, thereby strengthening digital capitalism. So though we may be actively participating, equality and justice do not automatically follow. Now, communicative capitalism has made its mark on documentary as well. There's been lots of buzz in the past 5 or 10 years about iDocs, which is sort of shorthand for either interactive documentaries or internet documentaries. And there's been a burgeoning of film festivals and aggregation sites dedicated to the form. In the words of Helen de Michel and Patricia Zimmerman, the emergence of new media and new platforms such as Web 2.0, social media, wikis, remix technologies, and amateurization of media tools have contributed partially and incrementally to changes and recalibrations of the documentary project, unquote. So these documentaries take a few different forms, but they often trade in information aggregation. So unlike the point of its emergence when documentary was about representational scarcity, iDocs wrestle with informational abundance. As media theorist Lev Manovich puts it, if the world appears to us as an endless and unstructured collection of images, texts, and other data records, it's only appropriate that we will be moved to model it as a database, unquote. Ironically, the intense privatization of politics that the iDoc demands as users click and navigate their way on their own personal devices may actually work against their ability to help form oppositional or counter publics. And one interesting thing about these interfaces is that you're rarely expected to explore all of the information that's presented. And in fact, studies have shown that people tend to spend about 5 minutes with an iDoc that they find online. So iDocs mobilize what Orit Halpern calls an aesthetic of information overload. In the words of one analyst, the promise of digital documentary is to encourage exploration, communication, and complexity. At the same time, these modes afford distraction, divided attention, and shallow engagement, unquote. And all you need to do is think about the different experiences of sitting back and watching a documentary at a community event or a documentary film festival or even on TV, versus kind of navigating a piece in which the author has marshaled a lot of data. And there's a really good example of this is Yann Arthus-Bertrand's very large UN-sponsored database of interviews with hundreds of people from around the world called 7 Billion Others. So since every interactive doc is different, the user spends most of their time trying to understand the design of the interface and figure out how to navigate it and what exactly is on offer by way of narrative or political intention. And so this may be interactive, but it tends to be exhausting at best and frustrating at worst. So iDocs take enormous resources on the part of their creators to not only curate a multitude of digital fragments, but also to design an interface and consider end-user engagement and distribution, which despite all of this effort is often nonetheless dismissed by its intended audience after only 5 minutes. With the exception of the NFB, which was an early supporter of artists making iDocs, most makers work alongside myriad other precarious creatives in the digital economy, following their passion without hope of remuneration, much like the journalists we heard about before. And this is an excellent example of what Tiziana Terranova has dubbed free digital labor. And as with all free labor, it extracts value that ultimately benefits someone else. In this case, it becomes part of the value of share prices for Google and other digital firms, which, as you know, we've heard earlier, insist that they have no accountability to the publics they serve, but are simply neutral providers for the free workings of the market. So put another way, what we end up with digital platforms is this amazing facilitation of multi-point distribution, but at the same time a real hobbling of discoverability and a real undermining of sustainable working conditions. Some of the most interesting documentary work that I've seen lately grapples with this faltering promise of digital technologies head-on. And I highly recommend Natalie Bookchin's Testament series that orchestrates the voices that she finds online into kind of choruses. Her piece superficially resembles the mosaic kinds of interfaces of iDocs, but actually it's not interactive. She does the work of connecting the pieces that we expect from really engaging and I think really political work. So I'd like to end by going back to the notion of democratic deficit. In her book, Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant argues that people want a more democratic experience. They really want to feel political together. And in the West, we have been taught that our public sphere and our public media, which supposedly serve it, are the epitome of democracy. Yet that story often runs counter to our actual experiences. Nevertheless, Berlant argues, despite all the evidence to the contrary, we maintain this optimistic attachment to democracy. And this attachment becomes cruel when, as she puts it, the object, scene of desire is itself an obstacle to fulfilling the very wants that bring people to it, unquote. In other words, our political lives are organized around a system that not only does not deliver what it promises, but actually damages our political ambitions along the way. It's not democracy as such, I think, that is the issue, so much as the way it has been twisted and undermined by capitalism. So liberal democracy, therefore, includes within it an obstacle to achieving its own stated aims. But because this ideology frames our public sphere, we are somehow at the same time unable to speak in any collective and sustained way about alternatives. So for example, when dealing with the issue of climate change, which came up earlier, the only alternative to capitalism that obtains any kind of visibility in mainstream media is green capitalism. So we end up sort of containing the very critique that we want to express. And in my view, iDocs are susceptible to the same cruel optimism as was documentary before it. And the reason is that both are, at base, technological fixes for a deep-seated democratic deficit. Whether it's visualization of the unseen forces that shape everyday life or mandatory participation on the digital platform, these are both strategies that are kind of always already compromised by their tethering to a damaging system. Nevertheless, we hold on to their democratic potential, hoping beyond hope that now, finally, we may yet achieve real democratic engagement. Nevertheless, the fact that digital technologies have converged with the political economy of neoliberalism does not mean that the two have to be confused. Digital technologies and the very special affordances they embody certainly do have the potential to be recast in a more democratic, even socialist vein. There's an important lesson to be drawn from the fact that ideas that were once avant-garde, experimental, and even politically radical have been made standard in our computing technology. And I'm thinking of things like collage or remix aesthetics or open and participatory texts, database aesthetics, and so on. And this forces us to consider that democracy or radicalism doesn't adhere to any particular aesthetic form. The capitalism that we're operating with now is a rebellious, disruptive, anti-authority kind of capitalism, and it pilfers whatever radical ideas it can, as long as capitalism itself is not put into question. So the openness of new documentary texts and their consonance with experimental aesthetics and exploratory ontologies may demonstrate that reality is always contested and unstable, but this also makes them vulnerable to charges of partiality and relativism. And again, this topic has come up before, but this current assault on truth or accusations of false news, I don't think that these are really that new. They harken back to the concern with defining reality that has been an ongoing element of our modernity, and to which different media forms, including documentary, have been kind of bent to serve. The challenge for documentary today is the same challenge, I think, faced by democracy, is to use participation and interactivity not solely as design features, but as a real rebuttal to the distributed management of difference that digital control societies operate so effectively. Participation is a double-edged sword, as it deflects the failure to participate, as in the case of structural exclusions, for example, back onto the individuals themselves. To fail to participate is to fail to be a citizen. And with digital participation made so effortless, lack of social improvement becomes our own fault. So to sum up my remarks and kind of conclude, I think we need to look closely at the democratic hopes that have been pinned to the documentary form from its outset, and again in a different way today. Both documentary and democracy have been depoliticized by states that are compromised by market ideology and compulsory forms of digital participation that take place in largely privatized ways. Social interpretation and visualization are always going to be political projects. However, if we assume the inherently progressive politics of particular media forms, we trap ourselves, again, in this kind of cruel optimism. And the takeaway is that there's no media shortcut to the really messy work of democracy. So, thank you. How about with my time?
Oh, you have 30 seconds left. Okay.
Thanks, Zoe. That was great. I'm wondering about, especially as we talk about the Canadian environment for documentary, the role that the National Film Board can potentially be playing in what it is that you're discussing here. That's something that is technically outside the free market system, and in the 60s, what was the series called? Challenge for Change, I think it was. Yeah, okay. That they had a series that was specifically something that was about social justice and changing the system. Could we be doing more that way, or is there something fundamentally flawed even with that approach, in your view?
Oh, geez. Thanks, Greg. Yes. As you know, I have a very...
This is in conflict with catching her plane.
The NFB runs the airline. No, I I feel very ambivalent about the NFB, and I think there is lots of potential there, and I think many of us have invested quite a bit of political hope in, the NFB as a media experiment. And certainly Challenge for Change is one of the experiments that was undertaken by the NFB in the 60s that has been cited around the world as a progressive participatory media experiment. So I don't want to say it's not simple. I think what you have in the NFB ultimately, though, is kind of this liberal containment of difference and of political struggle. And you have to remember that Challenge for Change was really a response by the state to what seemed like a very volatile political moment. And so it really truly was an attempt to get out ahead of violent social protests that were occurring elsewhere, particularly in the US, and to bring people into conversation and so on, which is not to say that a lot of really interesting and potentially radical work didn't happen, because I think it did. And so what I see in the NFB, certainly in that period, is a site where real contestation was occurring between quite different political positions, and you can kind of read it in the texts themselves, which are, in a strange way, like many of them, quite conflicted about what they're doing. In terms of the NFB now, it kind of gets back to the question that we discussed before, how public institutions have the luxury to innovate, and the NFB has certainly played that role and went very strong, I think around 2008, very precociously into digital, and through, had many cutbacks through the 90s, and working on a shoestring budget, fired many people, but the funds that they had, they focused on digital. So they were real innovators in iDocs, and they've gotten out ahead of that. And they are doing very interesting work now with First Nations Indigenous filmmakers. So I think it's a complicated story. I think it plays an important role in our media landscape, and would hate for it to not see it. But at the same time, I don't think it's doing as much as it could be doing, because of the way it's situated in relation to a fundamentally quite conservative state. And so I think it's very complicated. Thanks.
It is clearly impossible today to advance a traditional documentary project at the NFB. They simply aren't doing that kind of work anymore, even though it's what they've earned all kinds of Academy Awards for, and that's gone. And the talk in Ottawa is that the government is looking at creating some kind of super consolidated body where they would go all the oxes at once and put everything into one kind of super fund. And in some rumors, the NFB is part of that, and in some it's not. But that would mean having, the Canadian Media Fund, Telefilm, all of the programs that support book publishing, magazines, all consolidated into one super fund. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Thanks for your question. Like Greg mentioned, many of the policy tools that the Canadian state is working with are based on a distinction between media that no longer really apply. So, with convergence, it makes sense to think about how the money is being apportioned, and it perhaps makes sense to have some sort of super fund. I know, though, there are distinct traditions and networks in each of the media production fields, and so therefore there will be pushback, because inevitably some will suffer in that new reconfiguration, especially if it's put into the service of global export products, which has been the direction for sure that broadcast has gone into. But I know that the NFB and the CRTC have gone very strongly again into investigating the issue of discoverability, and feeling like no matter how much work Canadians put out there online, it can't be found. And I know that that's one of their biggest issues. So I think if they are planning to tie their funding, and you have to remember that basically 98, 99% of media produced in Canada are publicly subsidized. And would not be produced without that subsidy. I think what they are probably looking to move toward is some means of aggregating all of this work so that it can be found. And so the discussion of a Canadian Netflix or what have you. And I know Melanie Joly is also talking with Netflix and Google about prioritizing Canadian content within, within geocaching kind of. So I think, as Greg pointed out, I think there's a lot of kind of floundering around trying to figure out the right policy. But I think, I will support Greg's point, which is you need to figure out what your policy is attempting to do, and then find the policy tools that are going to help you achieve that, rather than just trying to flounder around and work with very amorphous ideas about, convergence or digital economy or digital media products. They actually have to figure out, and I think that's my point, is like, I think that's been lost. The idea of like, what is it that we are trying to produce? And mainly it seems like that what we're trying to produce are media commodities that will circulate well in the global market. And from my perspective, I don't think that's a very meaningful policy approach.
Yeah, and just a sub-question, would you be concerned in a scenario like that? It's just been my experience as a broadcast consultant and executive, that certainly at the level of the creators, the concern is that the fewer doors there are to knock on, the more it gets into the control of personalities, and it's possible to be blacklisted, and that the diversity is lost when you have just one door to knock on. Is that a concern you would share?
Yeah. No, I hadn't heard too much about that Superfund, but I think that would, yes and no. If it's run by peer-based juries, as some of the funding in Canada is, certainly for the arts or for the academy, if you involve people who are also themselves media producers, members of the public, in your assessments, then no. But if it does become a kind of black box and we don't know where our application goes and there's no accountability, then perhaps.
Yeah, there probably would be peer, but one of the problems, I think, like when you saw the protest by 75 filmmakers against the idea of folding telefilm into this, it's partly because it's put forward by someone perceived as a bad actor, someone who has a track record of vetoing projects on personality basis when he was in charge of certain things. Like personalities matter too, and if a bad actor can pervert the thing, then something's wrong with structure and governance, right?
Absolutely, but I also think that the policy so far that has guided telefilm has not been the same as what's guided the Media Fund. So it has not been as geared toward commodification and success at that level. It's been much more geared to international circulation to film festivals or aesthetic quality or these kinds of things. So I think the filmmakers have a lot to lose if it's going to get folded into the kind of the mandate of the Media Fund. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi. So thank you. I'm all excited by things that you said. So I'm Jennifer Good, and I'm at Brock University. And I was struck by the example that you gave of like when we talk about environmental change, and then green capitalism, like green consumerism came along to the sort of to the rescue. And so the way in which you highlighted how capitalism can really sort of consume all of this, and using it in the exploring in the context of documentaries, and I've been struck by a few of the speakers how they've touched on this idea of change, just kind of the possibility for change just kind of being consumed. So I used to think about digital, like sharing. I thought the sharing economy, this is going to be like the revolution. And of course now we, everything, Airbnb and Uber, it's all kind of, that wasn't. So I'm wondering, can you either give, can you think of examples where it's really digital, is demonstrating that sort of radical potential? Or when it's out there, how will we see it? What will it look like when we're looking at it?
Oh, man.
Please.
I knew this kind of question would come, and I'm not the person to answer this question because I don't do a lot of work on digital utopia stuff. Nick Dara-Witherford's here, and I feel he could speak to that, so maybe we'll get him to talk about that. But yes, we can all talk about ways that utopian ideas, good political, sound social and political ideas get compromised by their absorption into capitalist models, sharing being a great example. So I think that the answer to that is just to ensure that when these ideals and utopian kind of approaches are being mobilized, to just, again, follow the money and, see how sharing is in fact not sharing, right? So then the politically progressive version of that would be when sharing is sharing. And, and doesn't have value extraction being absorbed into multinational capitalism. So as to how people find each other, obviously a lot of this, and I think that's one of the points that I want to kind of reinforce here, is that when we do this alone, and those images of everyone with their phone kind of participating, but actually isolating themselves and atomizing themselves at the same time, is that true democratic activity happens collectively. And so whether that's online or not, right, I think it's about articulating whatever's happening online to other kinds of political action, and so that you don't end up in the situation where you're just clicking, liking, and sharing without seeing how you're actually moving your political ideas forward in other ways, right? So the environmental case being the most pressing one that we all need to be dealing with, which is we cannot look to technological fixes that re-inscribe capitalist extractivism for our climate crisis, right? So just making sure that the political economy of the solution is actually an alternative is just the key. But I'm not the person to give you great examples, like point at this and that, like hopefulness and Occupy and so on, because that's not the area that I work in. But there are people here, I'm sure, who can speak to that. So, thanks.
So thanks very much, Zoe, for an incredible talk. I'm not quite sure if thanks are appropriate for inviting me to respond to that question. But I just want to put forward a couple of propositions and really ask if you and other members of the audience would agree with this. One of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking was very much how, in fact, the emergence of what we today speak of as public media is the consequence of social struggles. It's the consequence of the struggles and then the attempts to contain them. And so the formulation that occurred to me at that point was that, in fact, the future of public media, to a certain extent, depends on tactical media, by which I mean those media that are actually involved in the mobilization of new forms of mass democratic movements. Because the very existence of a public sphere and the definition of a public sphere will emerge from those struggles. Now, the question that was just posed really is the eternal question of co-option. And this is a difficult one to confront because I, probably like many people here, have been involved in some generations of tactical media, the tactical media of the alter-globalism movement in the 1990s, Battle of Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. And then more recently, in 2011, the Occupy movements, all of which depended heavily on forms of digital mobilization, summit busting, take the squares, et cetera, et cetera. And those movements have not been very successful. And to some degree, we see, again, the sort of co-option of those tactics from the right in different forms. But it does seem to me that today, if a previous speaker asked, what would we point to today in the digital realm that holds some promise. And to me, it has been the appearance, actually since Occupy, of a whole series of digital media publications, which are not just involved with getting people out to demos, and summoning them to the street, but to the actual deep rethinking of what some form of post-capitalist society might involve, whether the initiative for that comes from labor movements, or whether it comes from green movements, feminist and anti-racialization movements. What I think of when previous speaker asked, like, where do you look today for this? I look to publications like Jacobin, publications like Salvage in the United Kingdom, publications like Viewpoint magazine, and a host of others in which we're actually seeing the digital used not just as an agitational means, but really for a deep philosophic rethinking of what the left is today. Because only that can actually drive the struggle, which will give the category of the public, if it is a category of social collectivity, any meaning whatsoever. If we lose that struggle, there is no public.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So my sense is we need to recognize that we are in a knife fight at this point. And what we need is in fact the media that has that fighting front orientation, because only from that will a concept of a public survive, or a new concept of a public emerge. So that's my proposition.
Here, yeah. That's awesome. Exactly, and I initially had, as part of this talk, more discussion from Chantal Mouffe about the necessary agonism of democracy, that democracy is not about consensus, it is about dissensus, but the point is that we need to articulate better, more clearly, what kinds of alternatives we can imagine to what we all clearly see as a problem with the current system, and we can focus our analysis of the problem squarely on just sort of how public media is being chipped away. But I think it is much more productive, as you suggest, to say public media was itself always only a kind of epiphenomenon of a struggle to create a national popular kind of public. And so if public media is in crisis, then the whole idea of the public that it's based on is even more so. And so rather than sort of continue to watch it be chipped away, yes, we need to take this initiative to reimagine, as many are doing, as you point out, to reimagine a post-capitalist future going forward. And so if public media can help us do that, then hurrah. If public media is too backward-looking and too much idealizing a kind of Cold War consensus-based kind of liberal democracy, then it's not actually going to help us move forward into this new struggle.